Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In this video, we are going to start into Chapter 6. And Chapter 6 is actually the first part of Part 3 of our textbook. So our textbook is divided up into a bunch of different sections. So Part 3 is when we start talking about our tools for evaluating frequency claims. So we're going to start breaking down the specifics about the types of claims that we mentioned in previous lectures. And so the next two chapters go into the specifics of frequency claims. So we're going to be specifically looking at surveys and observations today, and starting to describe what people do and what makes a good survey and what kind of observations are good and so on. And so for our overview of the chapter, we're going to talk about construct validity of surveys and polls. So setting up and defining our surveys and polls in a very good way. So getting good measures, getting good results, and having them test what we want them to test. We're also going to look at construct validity for behavioral observations. And if you remember back to when we started talking about frequency claims, surveys and behavioral observations were our major ways, our major sources of information to make those frequency claims. And so that's why we're going to spend today talking about these two different types of measures and the best way to go about doing it. So starting with our surveys and polls. Now, for the purposes of this class, we're going to use the terms survey and poll pretty much interchangeably. We're going to say that they mean basically the same thing, and that a survey and or poll is a method for asking people questions, either face-to-face or on the phone, through written questionnaires or online. So some method of asking people questions. For those who are curious, though, in the real world, in some cases, people will break surveys and polls into different categories. They'll talk about surveys as specifically asking people about consumer products. So you would be surveyed about how well your new dishwasher performs. Or we could talk about polls as asking people about their opinions. So you would be polled about your political standing. But again, for our class, we're going to talk about surveys and polls interchangeably as a method pretty much of self-report. And so, as we said, we're going to be talking about construct validity, and as a reminder from previous lectures, construct validity is concerned with whether the operationalization of a construct is measuring what it's supposed to measure. So when you set up your operational definition, is that actually giving you a measure of what you were intending to measure? So if you are looking for a measure of depression, do depressed people happen to score high on the measurements? Is it measuring what it should be measuring? And we'll look at lots of ways of evaluating this. So the first thing we want to talk about is if you're asking people questions through a survey or poll, you have a bunch of different ways that you can ask those questions. And each method of posing questions is going to come with different positives and negatives. So our textbook breaks it down into 4 broad categories of questions. So you can have open-ended questions, forced choice questions, you can use a Likert Scale, or you can use a semantic differential format, which is a fancy way of saying a modified Likert Scale. So I'm going to talk about each of these and give you some examples so that you can conceptualize what each of them is like. So for our open-ended questions, that's kind of exactly what it sounds like. You ask a person a question, and you don't restrict how they answer it. So you could ask a question like, what do you think of this class? So I haven't told you what I'm expecting as a response, so you could give any kind of response. You could say that you enjoy this class because you really love statistics, Or you could say that you hate this class because you don't like having to take a class to get your degree or something like that. And both of those are valid responses because I didn't specify what kind of information I'm looking to. So the pro here is that you can get a lot of rich information. You can get a lot of extra stuff, which is really useful. But the con, the negative side of that, is by getting extra information, now you have to try and quantify that extra information. So if you wanted to run statistics, how do you deal with that information? How do you code and categorize those responses that you've been given? And the more varied these are, the more varied the responses are, the more difficult and time-consuming it gets to try and quantify those responses to use in your research. So our next option is our forced choice format. And this removes some of that open-endedness by giving people options to choose from. So I could ask, do you like this class? Yes or no. So I'm forcing you to pick between yes or no. And this doesn't just have to be yes or no. I could be asking you, what is your preferred political party? And give you the options of the major political parties in Canada. I'm still forcing you to choose from the available options. Our next format of question is a Likert scale. And this is one of the most common types of scales you'll see, at least for psychological questions. And so for a Likert scale, you're going to see a question that is basically a statement that asks you how much do you agree or disagree with this statement. So you enjoy this class, agree or disagree. So if you strongly disagree with this statement, you would choose a 1. If you neither agree nor disagree, you choose a 3. If you strongly agree with the statement, you choose a 5. So this is a 5-point Likert scale. And this is really great because it's going to give us some numbers that we could use as a measurement. So we could use these numbers to run some statistics. So you don't have to code open-ended questions. You can use pre-existing numbers, which is pretty nice when you start liking statistics. And then our semantic differential format, as I said, is really just a modified Likert scale. So instead of asking you how much do you agree or disagree with a statement, a semantic differential format is going to give you a statement and then ask you to evaluate on something other than agree or disagree. So it's going to be anchored. You're going to have your highs and lows as adjectives. So an example is that if you're looking at rate my prof, they would use a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being you can show up and pass for how easy a course is, and 5 being it's the hardest thing you've ever done. So that is a modified Likert scale because we're using adjectives of very easy or very hard, and then you're quantifying somewhere between the two. So these two are very, very closely related, and both are going to give you hard numbers at the end as your measurements. And of course, now that we've presented some of our options, we should start critically evaluating, start thinking ahead about some of the problems that we can run into. So we can run into situations with leading questions. So a leading question is basically you ask the question in a way that shapes the person's response. And the textbook uses the example of, do you agree with voter ID laws that will prevent eligible voters from casting their vote? And this is a leading question because you're asking them, are they in favor of these laws? But you're giving extra information. You're saying that these laws prevent eligible voters from voting. So the logical way to interpret this is, even if you support these laws for other reasons, because it's framed as, do you want to prevent eligible voters from voting, maybe you're going to say no a little bit more often. So we can bias our responses by having this leading question, by having extra information that predisposes people to answer differently than they would answer otherwise. And if we're asking these questions to get an understanding of people and what they think, and we want real data, by biasing their responses, we're really not getting what we intended to get. So this is a really bad way to do it. And to try and avoid doing this, you should check all of your questions to make sure that there isn't any extra information. You want to make sure that the questions are neutral and that they're not leading people to a particular response. Our next problem type of question are double-barreled questions. And so an example of this would be, do you enjoy swimming and wearing sunscreen? And so this is a double-barreled question because you're actually asking two different questions. I'm asking, do you enjoy swimming? And do you enjoy wearing sunscreen? So if somebody answers yes to this question, are they saying yes, they enjoy swimming? Are they saying yes, they enjoy wearing sunscreen? Or are they saying yes, they enjoy both swimming and wearing sunscreen? So it's a little bit ambiguous. We're not quite sure what information we're getting from this kind of question because the question isn't really asking one thing. So if you wanted to do a good job with your questions, if you wanted to avoid this problem, you could ask two different questions. You could say, do you enjoy swimming? That's your first question. You could ask another question that says, do you enjoy wearing sunscreen? Or if you're asking, do you wear sunscreen while you're swimming, then remove the and make it very clear that this is all part of the same question. So you'll find that a lot of the problems that we're going to try and avoid revolve around making our questions clear and concise and unbiased. Because as soon as we have this ambiguity, when we're not sure what it means, we start running into problems. And when this is you collecting data for research, you really don't want extra complications because you'll get enough of that from research on its own. Our next problem that we can have are negatively worded questions. And this is, again, exactly what it sounds like. As soon as you start including things like, do you not do this? Or do you disagree that this should not happen? And as soon as people have to start working out, what are you actually asking? Again, we have some ambiguity. We're not quite sure if people understood the question or if you're asking it right. It's basically unclear. So the example here is, do you agree or disagree with this statement? People who do not drive with a suspended license should never be punished. And you can take a second and just go, wait, what? What are you asking? And you can't be sure that everybody has worked through exactly what you're asking. So if we wanted to make this a better question, we should say that people who drive with a suspended license should be punished, agree or disagree. And that is the least ambiguous way of wording it. But as soon as we include these do not and should never, it starts making people wonder. And again, if we're not sure that the person answering the question understands the question, then we're not sure if our data is any good. So yet again, we're going for clarity and most concise responses. And then our last point here is question order. And this is a really interesting one because you wouldn't necessarily think about it. But the order in which you ask questions can change how they respond to later questions. And a really great way of thinking about this is, have you ever been on a test, you're writing your multiple choice questions, you come across a question, and you have no idea what the answer is. They're asking you about a term that you can't remember, so you skip it. So you go to a question later on in the test, and they use that term in a sentence. And all of a sudden, you know exactly what the first question was asking because a later question gave you the information. So if you had had that later question earlier on, you wouldn't have had a problem with the question that you left blank. So the order of questions can give you different information, it can give you different ideas, it can get you on a different path of thinking. And it can also sometimes give you hints about what the study is about, and maybe people start shaping their responses and stuff like that. So you can run into issues where the order in which you present questions will change the types of responses that you get. And this isn't about clarity, this isn't about poorly designed questions, this isn't about trouble that way. This is just about people pick up cues from stuff they're presented with. So instead of, changing the question itself, you would actually have to change the way that you've set up your study to account for this problem. So if you're worried about question order influencing people's responses, you could instead try and use two versions of the study. One version where one question comes first, and then the second question comes later, and then you have a different version where the second question comes first, and the first question comes later. And by having both orders, you can actually compare the responding and see if people who did the version 1 responded differently from people who did version 2. And you do a large enough sample of people doing each version so that you can kind of pick apart what it is that's driving any differences. And if there's no effective question order, then both surveys should be giving you a pretty reasonable or pretty similar spread of the data, and you could just combine the two surveys, treat them as the same, because the order didn't matter. But if you're in one of those cases where the order of presentation affected how they answered, then you would include that difference in order in your paper when you write it up, because maybe it's important what order it's presented in, and maybe that's telling us something else about the thing you're studying. So you'd get more information on it. So that's the best way to counter question order affecting what's going on. Now, that's the side of things for researchers putting together the questions. Now we want to start thinking about the people who are answering our questions, our participants in the study. And for other sciences, there's a lot of, looking down their nose at psychology, because psychology uses a lot of self-report measures. We ask people what they're thinking, or we get them to fill out surveys that gives sort of an opinion on something. And other fields might not agree that asking people opinions is a good way to get information. But sometimes asking these kinds of questions is the only way to get this information. So if you're asking somebody, we could look at some of the examples over here. My life is close to my ideal. So we can't quantify someone's vision of an ideal life. We can't quantify how happy someone is in their life without asking them about it. It's really hard to evaluate someone's happiness or goals in life without asking them what their goals are. So there are certain types of questions that are the only way to get that information. And so people can give meaningful responses. There can be really important information here. And sometimes there are ways around asking those questions. So something like ethnicity, you could follow their family heritage back. But it's a lot easier to just include a single question about what is their family history. Things like age and gender, you could look up their birth certificate, or you could just ask them. So self-reports are sometimes just the most efficient way to do it. So sometimes it's about efficiency, sometimes it's about being the only way to get those questions. But as always, we're going to put on our critical thinking hats and think about the other stuff that we should keep in mind when we're using self-report type scenarios. So one of the big things that we have to watch out for with surveys, especially with long surveys, sometimes people can use shortcuts. These shortcuts are called response sets. And it's basically like a set of rules so that when you're tired and don't want to make a real decision, what response are you going to give? So imagine that you've given somebody, instead of a 5-choice test, so instead of giving them 5 statements to agree or disagree with, what if you gave them 500? How long before they get bored and stop carefully reading each question? So when they get bored, they can fall back on these shortcuts or response sets, and they'll use a rule of what they should be answering. So one of the most common ones that you'll see is called acquiescence, or yay saying, which is basically you agree with every statement that's given. So you would say, my life is close to my ideal. Sure. Conditions are excellent. Sure. Satisfied. Yes. 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 You stop reading them and you just say yes. This is troublesome because you're not actually getting an accurate measure of what that person thinks of any of these statements. You're just getting their default, yeah, sure, I agree. There are some ways around that, but we'll come back to that in just a minute. The next problem that you can have is fence sitting. So instead of acquiescence, you say yes to everything. Fence sitting is when you pick a neutral response. So instead of having an opinion, maybe you're going to say, I neither agree nor disagree. So you could circle 3 on all of these because, whatever. I'm not really agreeing with your statement. I'm not really disagreeing with your statement. I'm going to play it safe and choose something in the middle. And this can also be really common, not so much when people are just ignoring information, if they're not reading it fully, but it can also be seen if your information is, say, a confrontational viewpoint. So if you're asking people about what they think about abortion, if they don't want to have a confrontation, maybe they're going to pick a neutral response. That neutral response isn't necessarily an accurate representation of what they really think, but they're picking that safe option so that they don't have to make a problematic choice. So lots of problems with potential responses and other ways that people can bias their answering. And we can actually look at, so we have those response sets, or choosing not to give a response. You can also have people who choose a response because they want to look a certain way. We can have socially desirable responding, or faking good, where with the question, you kind of know what the socially acceptable response is. Maybe you're applying for a job and they ask you, like, do you agree or disagree with this statement? I have never stolen supplies from work. And you know that the answer is, of course, I have never stolen supplies from work. Even if you are a slightly dishonest person, and maybe you have, but you're going to respond the way that you're supposed to respond because you know you're supposed to respond that way and you're faking good. Sometimes, a little bit more rarely, you'll see the opposite, where people fake bad. And this is really common if people are trying to impress someone. So maybe you're asking questions about number of sexual partners. So people might lie so that they're a bad boy or a bad girl to impress someone, which is problematic again, because we're not really getting at what we wanted. Our next problems that we can run into are people who self-report more than they actually know. And so this is kind of a limitation on both the side of the person taking the survey, but also the person who's giving the survey. So you might ask a question like, why do you choose this particular brand of shampoo? And maybe you don't actually know why you choose that brand of shampoo. You could probably come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was the cheapest one in the store. Maybe it was on sale. But maybe you chose it for some unconscious reasons, like you have seen advertisements of it and it's familiar, so you got that one over something else. So you're asking somebody a question that they might not be able to accurately respond to, but people will try and fill in those blanks and respond anyways. So you have to be pretty critical about the information that you're getting. Another thing we have to keep in mind is self-reporting memories of events. So you would think that the person who experienced something would be the best person to ask about that experience. But especially if you can think back to intro psychology, when we started talking about flashbulb memories and how fluid our memories can be, you realize that people are really bad at remembering things, especially long times afterwards. Our memories are fluid and will adapt. And we can be pretty confident in what we think we remember, but there's no guarantee that that's actually accurate. So the most recent big study looking at flashbulb memories, those being memories associated with very large and emotionally startling events, the most recent big one that we can talk about is when September 11th happened. And researchers started interviewing people about what they remembered about the day of September 11th. And so they interviewed people the day after. And they asked them, so where were you when you first found out? Who was with you? Give us all these details. And then the researchers checked back in with those people after longer and longer periods of time, and they found that details were left out or changed, or they added new details that had never been there before over time. So their memories didn't stay the same, they evolved and changed and modified over time. So we have to keep in mind that our memories aren't necessarily accurate. And another cool one that the textbook touches on is people are really bad at doing things like rating products. And so you'd think that with how popular online shopping is and people giving good ratings or bad ratings to products that they get, a study looking at what our product ratings are correlated to actually found that 5-star product ratings tend to be associated with products that have a decent price and are made by a good brand, and not necessarily with the performance of that product. So people tend to rate things highly because it was a good value and it came from a well-recognized brand, as opposed to because it actually worked well. So we have all sorts of biases to consider. Now, before I move on, I actually want to talk about how can we fix or get around some of these biases? How can we try and encourage people to give accurate responses? So I'm going to bounce back first and talk about getting around response sets. And it's really hard to force people not to do this, but what you can do is recognize when it's happening. So what you could do for acquiescence is you can look at what happens if I reverse the statement. So if you're asking somebody, are you happy today? And they are following the response set of yay saying, they say yes. If a couple of points down, maybe you ask, are you unhappy today? And if they're actually reading and responding in a good way, if they're giving you good data, good responses, they should change and say that, no, I'm not unhappy because I said that I was happy earlier. And so with those tests, those reversals, you could be a little bit more certain that they're not using a responding set. However, if the person says, yes, I'm happy, and then says, yes, I'm unhappy, then you could be pretty sure that they're following this response set, and you would probably discard their data. So you could remove them from the study, you'd make a statement in your scientific write-up saying that people who weren't paying attention to the different questions were removed by checking reversals of different statements. So you have a way to explain how you got rid of bad data, but also a way of knowing if someone's giving you valid responses or not. It's a little bit harder to get rid of these fence sitters. So there's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this. The first is you can remove that middle option. So instead of having a score from 1 to 5, what if strongly agree was actually number 4? And so somebody can't say neither agree or disagree. They either have to a little bit disagree or a little bit agree, but there is no neutral response. Now that's good to try and get people to tell you which way they're leaning, but you run then into a new problem. And this new problem is, what about the people who actually don't have an opinion? What if they don't agree or disagree? What if they legitimately have no opinion on this matter? So you run into an issue there. If you're doing a verbal survey, you can actually have another option off to the side where if the person says, I don't know, or no opinion, there's an option removed from the options in the center. So your Likert scale would only be 1 to 4, or maybe 1 to 6, some kind of even number with no neutral option, but you give a neutral option off to one side. And that would give people who legitimately have no opinion a way of saying they have no opinion, but hopefully the people who are fence sitting won't choose those options. And again, it's not an ideal solution, but we would hope that it does a decent job. All right, back to our other things that we're looking for. For trying to look good, this one is a little bit difficult to get rid of, but you could assure people of their anonymity, which we've already talked about in ethics. You kind of have to have anonymous responding for most of these kinds of questions. So if you remind them at the very beginning of the study or right before they start answering the questions, say, hey, just so you know, no one is ever going to know you gave these answers. No one is ever going to see your answers associated with your name. So you can include that extra, this doesn't matter for you, and hope that people will, instead of sort of trying to look good, will realize that it doesn't matter for them, and they'll answer honestly. At least that's our ideal hope. For these problems at the bottom, you kind of have to be a little bit more critical. So you could try and avoid questions where they couldn't know the answer. Or you can ask what they think the answer is, but follow up with extra studies. For memories of events, maybe instead of asking them to remember what happened, you'd be better off using some kind of behavioral measure. Maybe you get them to bring a voice recorder. Maybe you get a camera set up so that you can actually observe the event instead of memories of the event. And for product ratings and other things like that, you just keep in mind that self-reporting isn't necessarily the best way to get that measurement. And there are lots of other ways you can get around this. You could ask other people to give an opinion of someone else. So instead of asking, are you a nice person? To which most people would say, yeah, of course I'm a nice person. Maybe you could ask their best friend. Maybe you could ask their mother. And get a sort of more objective, neutral response. So the person can't fake good because you're not asking them, you're asking someone else. But of course, you have to make sure it's a question that they could likely answer, and then you have to find friends. So, as always, there's pros and cons for all of our options. But there are lots of ways that we can think our way around some of the restrictions and critical problems with different types of questions. And it's good to know that these methods exist and that we can try different things to get a better response or an accurate response. All right. So that was our self-report measures. Now we want to go into our behavioral observations. So observational or behavioral research. And I told you before, those two terms are going to be very interrelated. We'll use both pretty much interchangeably. But observational research is when a researcher watches some people or other animals and systematically records their actions. So you can sit in a field with a clipboard and make notes on what's happening. You can set up a video camera and watch different behaviors. You could have voice recorders and measure different words or whatever. If you are observing a behavior and the person doesn't have to self-report on that behavior, then you're doing behavioral research. And we're talking about behavioral observations in terms of frequency measures right now, but it isn't exclusively used in frequency measures. So this could be used for experimental research. This could be used for correlational research. This isn't specific just to frequency measures. And I forgot to mention that earlier, but we're just considering them or framing them in terms of frequency measures because that's the part of the textbook that we're in right now. And so to give an idea of types of observational or behavioral research, we're actually going to look at 3 examples out of the textbook. So the first of these is an experiment that was looking at how much people talk. If you have ever heard the saying that women talk more than men, these researchers wanted to actually quantify that. They wanted to figure out, okay, is that a real thing or is that a saying from society? Is it a scientifically back-upable fact or is it something else? And so in this case, they had people who were given these recording devices and they would wear a microphone, and throughout the day, every 12.5 minutes, this recorder would turn on, and for 30 seconds, it would record what was happening in the environment. And so because the microphone is really close to the person wearing it, if that person is talking, then it would pick up on what they were saying. And so they had research assistants who would listen to what was recorded, and they would write down what was being said so that they could count the number of words that their participants said throughout the day. So we get a pretty good sampling of different parts of the day, not all at once, because if you had to transcribe everything a person said, that would be a lot of work. But they still get a pretty good sampling of what someone is saying. And so if they have female participants who would wear the recorder, they'd also have male participants who'd wear the recorder, and then they could tally up how many words the people were saying every day. And so over here, we were looking at, they did 6 separate types of samples, different years in different places, and they looked at them for different durations. They give us all this information, and we could look at how many women participated and how many men participated. And then they could calculate our frequency measure of how many words on average were spoken each day by men and women. And you'll notice that these numbers are actually pretty close together. So overall, our women are saying a little bit more than men. We're getting a higher on average number of words spoken by women than by men. But when we run the statistics here, there's no statistical difference between this number and this number. We'll talk about statistics in a future chapter, but we'll hand wave that part and say that for the effects of statistics, this number is about the same as this number, and we don't really find a large difference in how much women talk versus men, which is a really cool finding, and it tends to go against a pretty commonly accepted saying, which is very cool. Another study was talking about looking at hockey parents. So for those of you who are not Canadian, in Canada, there are children who play hockey. They start very young. I have cousins who have been playing hockey since they were 4. And so their parents get very invested in the sport. And there are lots of news stories talking about these crazy hockey moms and hockey dads who will see something happen on the ice. They'll get really worked up. They'll start yelling. They'll swear. They'll throw fits. They'll do all sorts of crazy things. So you can get situations like this where a parent will storm the ice and start shouting at people for whatever reason. And so there's a lot of media stories about these aggressive parents, especially at children's games and even young children's games. And so the researchers wanted to figure out, okay, is this a bias that we're seeing because the newspapers are only reporting these bad situations? Or is there this very large majority of people who are aggressive and loud and violent at these hockey games? And so they set up an observational study. And so the researchers actually went to the hockey rink. They sat in the stands at their local arena and they watched the game. And they brought a notebook with them and they would record any time a parent made some kind of comment. And so they'd quantify, okay, are they positive comments? Are they negative comments? Are they neutral? So positive being maybe you're cheering for your child or maybe you're cheering for your team. Neutral would be something that isn't positive or negative. That's kind of the catch-all for stuff in the middle. And then negative would be that you're doing terribly, or the ref is making a bad call, or I disagree with this situation. And despite all of the positive or the popular media articles talking about these aggressive parents, of all the studies they did, they found that about 64% of the comments are positive and only 4% were negative. So most of the comments were positive. What was left was mostly neutral, and there's a very small proportion of negative comments. So this goes against what we think of in terms of hockey parents and people being aggressive at their children's games. And then for our final example, a different type of observational study was researchers were interested in what families were talking about in the evening. And we're looking at sort of how they're talking and what they're talking about, and children versus parents, who's saying what. So this is a little bit more involved than the previous studies. But in this case, they had families where parents both worked outside of the home, and they would have a camera crew follow the parents after they came home from work and document their interactions with their children as they went through sort of their evening routines, how they had dinner, and all that sort of thing. And then the observers would rate the emotional tone of their conversation. So is it cold or is it warm? Are they sort of hostile and indifferent to their children, or are they warm and happy? As well as what were they talking about? And so we found that for the most part, the emotional tone taken by everybody involved was relatively positive. So they tended to score pretty high on emotional tone of conversation. And when they talked about topics of conversation over dinner, the children were more likely to complain or have negative conversations about the taste of the food, whereas the parents were more positive, talking about how nutritious the food was or how good it is. And so we can evaluate what they're talking about and what tone they were using. And this is an observational study. So if we've talked about our self-reports and now we're talking about our observational research, which one is better? And so again, it's still going to depend, but sometimes having an observation could be better than a self-report. And again, you have to keep in mind if this is something that you can actually observe. Because like we said, sometimes self-reports have to be used because you're trying to measure something that can't be observed. But observations can be a way of making reliable and valid observations. But as always, we have some things to keep in mind. So the first thing that we want to keep in mind or consider is our observer bias. And this happens when an observer is going to see what they expect to see. So we're saying that an observer's expectations can actually influence how they're interpreting a participant's behavior. And that can have a big influence on the outcomes of research because we have this implicit bias included in our results. So if the observer, the person who is observing and recording measurements, has an idea of what they expect to see because of the theory or the hypothesis that we're working from, then they might not be completely objective in how they're interpreting what they see. And this is particularly important or particularly problematic when we have situations where observers are interpreting ambiguous data. If they're not really sure what to do with that information, if they have an idea of what they would expect to see, anything ambiguous kind of gets put into their expectations, which again is really problematic. So a really good example of this is an experiment where they showed a bunch of people a video. And they were showed this man who was talking and answering questions about his life and his work history. Now, some people who were shown that video were told that he was a man taking a job interview. Other people were told that the man was a psychiatric patient and this was part of his intake interview. Now, depending on what these people were told, when they were asked to describe the person, their interpretations of who he was were very, very different. So by being told that he was at a job interview, they would say, oh yeah, it's very positive. He's an open person talking about all of these things. But if he was told to be a psychiatric inmate, then they were told that, or they responded that he was cold and distant and all of these other negative things. So just by how that data is presented, how the video was presented, what the observer was expecting to see, a normal person at a job interview or someone at a psychiatric hospital, that dramatically influenced the kind of feedback that they were given. So massive influence on our research. Another very related problem that we can run into are observer effects, sometimes called expectancy effects. And this is kind of the opposite side of things. So for our observer bias, the observers are the ones who are causing the problem. But with observer effects or expectancy effects, it's actually the participants that are causing the problem here. And this is when a participant changes their behavior to conform with the observer expectations. So they're going to behave in the way that they assume they're supposed to behave. And there are some really cool studies talked about briefly in the textbook. The first is the example of bright and dull rats. And this is kind of a weird one, but bear with me. So back in the 60s, they had a bunch of psychology undergraduates, and each individual was given a bunch of rats. And they were told that these rats were either maze bright rats, meaning that they were bred to do really well in mazes, or they were told that they were maze dull rats, meaning that they were unintelligent. They were bred to do not well in mazes. In fact, the rats were all genetically identical because you can do that with rats. So no group actually had smart or dumb rats. It was just that the people running the experiments were told that they were either good at mazes or bad at mazes. And the really cool part is that at the end of the semester, the maze bright rats actually did better than the maze dull rats, even though there was no difference in their ability to perform. So their behavior matched what was expected, what was supposed to happen based on the observer's understanding. So maybe the rats were reading cues from their experimenters or something, but it's a really neat situation where the behavior matches the expectations, which is kind of cool. And another really great example is Clever Hans, which if you have never heard about him, Clever Hans was a horse, this horse, in fact, who was famous around the world for being able to do math. He could count, he could add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and he was about as accurate as any fifth grader, which for horses is really, really smart. And so they would tour him around, they'd bring him to different places, and they'd show off his amazing ability to count. Now, of course, scientists were convinced that the horse was just following signals from the handler. So they separated the horse and the handler. And so they would have a scientist who would ask the same kinds of questions and get the horse to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And wouldn't you know it, the horse could do it. And so they kept going, they kept looking into this, and they figured out that the horse was actually responding to subtle cues, subtle body language adjustments from whoever was asking the question. And they figured this out by having someone hold up a card, and if it was, say, the 9 of hearts, then they would want the horse to give them 9 hoof beats. So that's how he was getting across he was counting. So if the answer was 3, then he would stomp his foot 3 times. So if you had the 9 of hearts, then the horse should stamp his foot 9 times. And to figure out what was going on, they had some people who would pick up the card, they would look at it themselves, and then they would show it to the horse. And then they had another group that would pick up the card, but they wouldn't be able to see it, and they would show it to the horse. And if the person holding the card knew what the number was, knew how many times the horse was supposed to stamp, when the horse hit that number, so after he had stamped his foot 9 times, the person would adjust their posture. Maybe they would relax a little bit, maybe their expression would soften, but the horse would know to stop because he had reached that correct point. But when the person holding the card didn't know what the card said, the horse wasn't getting any cues to stop, and so he didn't know when to stop. And so that's how they figured out that Hans was reading body language. He was reading tension or leaning forward or facial expressions. So he was still very clever, but not for doing math, for actually reading human body language, which is really cool in and of itself. All right, and so following our normal pattern, if we have these problems with observer bias and observer effects, how can we get around them? And there's lots of different ways that we can do this, but we're going to talk about some specifics. One of the good ways to do this is having multiple well-trained observers. So just like in the last chapter when we talked about having inter-rater reliability, by having multiple people, then maybe you could see any biases that exist. If one person is prone to overly positive scoring and one person is prone to overly negative scoring, then maybe you can retrain your observers to get rid of their pre-existing biases. And by having multiple observers to compare, you can have a better feel for how accurate or how good your observers are. Again, you want to keep in mind that if they're biased, 2 observers could be biased the same way. So multiple well-trained observers is all well and good unless they have the same bias, in which case you kind of have to find another way around it. So the best way and the most common way that we're going to see in most studies is when you use a masked or blind design. And this is a situation where the observer, the person doing the measurements, isn't told what condition the participant is in, and even better, if you don't tell them what the experiment is about. So if you just tell them that they're measuring smiles, and you're not telling them when we expect people to smile more or less, or even why they might be smiling, then you're going to get a much more neutral or unbiased response from that observer. So this blind design is a lot better because you don't have any expectancy from the observer to either affect how they are measuring things, but even still, it can't affect the people that they're observing because they don't have any expectations. So it's kind of a win-win, which is why we see blind designs fairly often. Next, we want to consider another problem with studying people and other animals, and this is reactivity. So we've talked about the fact that people change their behavior when they're observed. So if you know someone is watching you, you're going to act differently. So maybe if somebody is watching you eating at a buffet, maybe you're going to eat less because you don't want to look like a pig. Or if you're handing out snacks, maybe you're going to give everyone an equal share because the teacher is watching. So this reactivity means that when we're observing people, we aren't necessarily getting a good measure of their natural behavior. We're only getting a measure of their behavior when they know they're being watched. So how can we minimize or get rid of this reactivity? One way is that you can blend in, make what are called unobtrusive observations. And that's the example we're seeing here. So this woman is watching interactions between children, but she's watching from behind a one-way mirror. So this mirror, she can see through it to the children, but the children can't see her. So they don't know that they're being observed and they can't change their behavior. Another way that you can do it is you can wait. So wait it out. Wait until this reactivity stops happening. And this is basically that you go into the situation and you allow the people you're watching to acclimatize to your presence. So if you've ever been in a classroom that was being evaluated, you'll find that the person doing the evaluations will usually stay in the classroom for a couple of days. The assumption is that the first day, the students are very aware of the evaluator sitting in the classroom. The teacher is very aware of them being there. Maybe they're a little bit nervous. So for the first day, you're not actually getting any useful data. You're just there to let them get used to your presence, to acclimatize to your presence. After that, once they're used to you, then you can start getting accurate behavioral measurements. And this is the method that Jane Goodall used when she was studying her gorillas out in the jungle. So at first, her presence was disruptive and she was bothering them and disrupting their normal behaviors. But over time, they got used to her being there and they started acting normally again. So it takes longer, but you're going to get better results in the long run. And then our last option is actually a really cool one. And this is that you measure the behavior's result, not the behavior itself. And I had a little bit of trouble conceptualizing what the textbook was getting at until I had an example. So if you wanted to measure, say, which pathway children or students take across campus, if you want to know where people walk, if you sat out on the quad and watched people walk, people might change their behavior because you're sitting there watching them. Maybe if there's a university official watching students walking and they have a clipboard, maybe the students will stick to the path. But if you measure the behavior's result, the outcome of students following set paths, then maybe you're going to see something different. So if you leave them alone and come back later on, you could see that there's a path worn where the grass is not growing anymore. And that path is going to show you the pathway that students take most often. So you're getting the result of which way they prefer to walk, not by watching them walk, but by seeing the effects in the environment of them walking. So you can get this kind of data unobtrusively because you're not measuring it directly, you're measuring something else. So another example would be if you wanted to figure out what kinds of junk food people are eating in the dorms, instead of going door to door and asking people, maybe you would just check their trash, see what kind of wrappers you're finding, and figure out that that's what they're eating. So an indirect method of measuring their behavior. And so we come to the end of the chapter, and hopefully some of you are sitting there thinking, well, wait a second. This observing people stuff feels a little bit scummy, especially with what we talked about in our chapter on ethics, where you have to have our educated responses, or I'm drawing a blank on the word here. Give me a second. Informed consent. Ooh, it's a good day. So informed consent, where you have to be told about what's going on in the experiment and you have to consent to that happening. And for most of the stuff we've talked about, there hasn't been a lot of chat about informed consent. And so we run into this question of, is it actually ethical for researchers to be observing behavior for others? And as always, the short answer is it depends. The long answer is that we could have an entire class talking about when it's ethical or not ethical and what situations warrant secret observations and others don't. But most of the time, it's going to depend on the situation and what you're using the information for and all sorts of stuff like that. Some of the quick ways we can think about this is if you're observing something that's happening in public. So if you're sitting at the bus stop and you're counting how many red cars go by, you're pretty much okay. Because if someone's doing something in public, they're aware that they're being observed. And as the researcher, you're not actually associating any specific person with any specific behavior. So it's not like you're giving their information away or doing anything weird. You're just taking a sampling of what's happening in public. When you're looking at things happening in private, it gets a little bit more gray. Sometimes you can get around it by recording someone and then approaching them and telling them that you want to use a recording of them for your research and that you need their consent to do so. If they give you the consent, then you can use the recording you took. If they don't give you consent, then you have to delete that recording without having looked at it. You can't use it for your research. And there's lots of other little things that you can use or not use depending on the situation. But that is a more ethical debate, and we'll talk more about some of that stuff again throughout the course as we talk about different kinds of research and different ways that ethics apply. But we will leave it there for today.